Hello there. Welcome to Agree or Disagree the podcast. It is Kevin Olenick. Of course, this is a controversial podcast that pushes you to think differently and connects with you with your community. We record every Wednesday and Thursday. You can find us on Spreaker.com, Kevole, Soundcloud.com, Kevole. You can also find us on YouTube, Kevin Olenick. You can follow me on Twitter at Kevole, Facebook, Kevin Olenick. You can Agree or Disagree the podcast on Facebook. Follow me on Instagram, Kevole. And if you want, check out my Patreon at Kevole, which I've done absolutely nothing for. But check it out! Last week there was a interesting conversation / debate, dialogue. I don't know what to really call that. We're going to talk.
Discussion is fine.
A discussion is, yes, I think that's a very fair way to say it. It was a discussion between a Christian and an atheist sitting in a table at Westside Church, questioning which is better for. It was really a dialogue on human rights, which was a better way, or which I don't think we came to a conclusion on, but we'll have a conversation about that. And we're here to review it. The discussion was between Ian Bushfield, who is the executive director of the BC Humanist Association and a humanist officiant, and he campaigns for a better world through science and compassion. And Andy Bannister is the Christian that was involved. He has written a book called The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, or The Dreadful Consequences of Bad Arguments. And it was moderated by a man by the name of Steve from Apologetics Canada in Abbotsford. It was a really well-attended event, and you may have heard my guest today. I was walking around thinking I would just review this by myself, and lo and behold, I find David Simpson, who was on this podcast before. He had some opinions, and we just thought that we would review the event. So the topic really of this is we're going to break down how we're going to do this. Really, is it which is better for human rights, or maybe how Christianity and atheism look at human rights? I think that's probably a better way to say that, because I don't feel that the event, and David, you can certainly chime in here, I don't feel that this was a debate.
No, and that was one good feature of the debate, of the discussion.
Yes.
Debates tend not to be conducive to finding the truth. It has a lot more to do with the skill and oratory power of the speakers than it does the actual, which arguments are better. And so when you have a discussion, you can correct someone live and say, "Oh, wait, sorry, I'm not sure what you meant by that. Can you clarify? Can you give why you think that?" And they also tend to be more respectful because you have that, the responses are given live, and it was very respectful. There was lots of comic moments too. So it was very good. Both parties were very respectful. Now I happen to have, in some ways, more sympathy with Ian Bushfield, and the term he defends more than atheist is humanist,
right? Yes,
right, or secular humanist to be exact. And just to, I guess, start with some agreements that I have.
Yeah. Before we get into that, I think that this was a really important couple of things about the event. It was pretty well attended. I don't know about you, but I always get a little concerned, and I say this as a Christian, when these are events that are at a church, and because it feels like there is some sort of opportunity for evangelism, as I'm using this in air quotes, and it's sort of, I feel it's a road game for in some senses, not that this was a game, but you know what I mean?
No, like the event is put on with an agenda, whereas this, it looked like it really was there for the conversation.
Yes.
It was, the goal was to have, multiple worldviews represented, honestly debated, honestly discussed, I should say.
Yeah. And
I think they did a good job. I think the moderator did a good job of, representing both sides well and being able to ensure that it didn't turn into an angry debate. So I think that you're right to notice that it didn't seem geared towards evangelism, that it really was just there for the sake of conversation.
Yeah. And the moderator was named Steve Kim from Apologetics Canada, and he really did a really good job of kind of keeping everybody on track and keeping the question. We'll maybe talk about the questions that were asked a little bit later, including someone in this room, David. Which was a good question. So, and I don't know if this was something that was common or what's the plan is, but and Ian really this was the first time he did something like this, and I thought he came across really well spoken, really well prepared, really intelligent. He didn't. He debunked some of the things, like he put the guy with the mustache in the corner in the sense of yes.
That's right, because whenever there's a debate about, the social impact of religion or atheism, inevitably it turns to, what about the Crusades, or what about Hitler, or what about that? And those tend to be not very productive debates. And so I think that was a good extension of the olive branch. So let's not talk about Hitler. Now, one person who asked a question did not abide by that olive branch agreement. But we don't need to talk.
We don't need to talk about that. Well, maybe we'll do the Q&A later. So how we're going to do this basically is we're going to talk about the terms that were used and where we have an agreement with Ian and a disagreement with Ian, maybe, and an agreement with Dr. Bannister and a disagreement with Dr. Bannister. So we'll open that up and then we'll kind of dialogue from there.
Right. The most obvious agreements that I have with Ian is that I am also a humanist and an atheist. So I do believe, as he put it, that morality should stem from human reason and it should be aimed at solving human problems. Right? I think that we don't need supernatural sources for moral judgments. I think that morality and moral standards should grow out of human conversation, human dialogue. So a fairly obvious place of agreement. Another place of agreement was something he brought up quite early, which is a old philosophical problem called the Euthyphro dilemma, which is basically, if God is the grounding for morality, so let's say we agree that giving to charity is good. Now someone says, well, someone says what grounds that is God's commanding charity. Okay, so is giving to charity good because God commands it? Or does God's commandment make... I'm saying this wrong. Is giving to charity right because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's right? If it's the first case, then God could command anything. The basis of morality seems arbitrary. It's based on God choosing something at random. If it's the second one, if God commands giving to charity because he recognizes that it's right, then the rightness of giving to charity is independent of what God wills. And this was a problem that Ian brought up early on. I think that is a serious problem for typical theological views of morality. Now, there are various responses. Maybe we can get into that, but maybe I'll give you a chance.
Okay, yeah. I think, I do think that if you look through history, there has been, and he also brought up a very interesting question to dig through about human rights. We'll get into and how have they evolved or not. And I think that there is something within us that has said, this is the right thing to do, this is not the right thing to do. I think that that's been there through human time. Now, I think where we disagree is you made the statement that God commanded. I don't know if I look at, can I buy you a coffee today? It wasn't because God commanded me to buy you a coffee. It's because I feel that that's the right thing to do. I don't think that... I think maybe the presentation of where Christianity has stumbled a bit has made morality a black and white issue. Right. It's either you give me... I offer to buy you a coffee or not. Well, it's like, well, wait, let's unpack this a little bit. What if I don't have the money to buy you a coffee? Or what if you are allergic to coffee and I'm offering you to buy you a coffee and I'm completely insensitive to that? Or think, I'm simplifying this for the conversation, but...
No, of course, yeah, and that's right. And I think that naive interpretations of Christianity lend themselves to a very black and white, absolutist view of morality. But whereas a Christian who's more well-educated can say, no, morality is more complicated than that.
Yeah.
There's different things to take into consideration. But as far as the problem of the euthyphro, I think still remains. And this is really the subject of the debate. What is the basis of moral judgment? What is the basis for saying anything is right? So, let's take the most obvious case. It's good for a mother to take care of her children. Right? It's something just really basic we all recognize. It's good for parents to take care of their children. Okay, why is it good? What is the basis for it? Is that basis in God somehow? Or is it just right by virtue of some good reason, and God just recognizes that it's good? And if the second one, if it's just that God recognizes that it's good, well then we can appeal to the reasons by themselves. We don't need to appeal to God. That's kind of the force of the euthyphro. And maybe we don't spend too much time on that. It's just something that was just brought up briefly in the conversation. But that is one point of agreement between me and Ian. I think the euthyphro is a real problem.
I don't necessarily disagree with him on that. I don't necessarily disagree that I think that there's something about, to me, this is going to sound a little weird, but I believe it would be God and humans that have almost created some sort of moral code in community. It's not necessarily to me that, and I guess this is the way I look at it, and I'm not the most philosophical man out there, but I look at it that God presented 10 commandments, right? But there were things, I think, there were times in Scripture that we read stories that humans challenged God on, and had God change his mind on things. So I do think that there's a human-God element in this moral conversation, that it's not necessarily strictly coming down from the heavens, but it's a community thing.
Right, yeah, and actually I'm pleasantly surprised you've put it like that. That's actually a very Jewish view. If you talk to modern Jews, many of them have no trouble at all with the idea of arguing with God or with wrestle. I mean, actually, interesting enough, the word Israel means to wrestle. To
wrestle with God.
With God, and then Abraham argues with God, and this happens, right? As you said, God in the Old Testament changes his mind.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess I don't have a problem with that, except I don't think God exists. But
fair.
But I think that where you are agreeing with Ian is that our moral views do emerge out of conversations, right? They emerge out of discussing it vigorously. Now, just to jump the gun very slightly, where I get off that bus or get off that hobby horse is, I think that the conversation can be truth-seeking, right? That there are better and worse moral codes we can arrive at. And towards the end of the debate, Ian kind of walked away from that and admitted that he was a relativist, that he thinks that there's, which for those of you who don't know, relativism means that there are no moral truths or moral facts of the matter. I don't know what you would say to that.
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. So it sounds like, maybe you can elaborate a bit more, that it sounds like you agree with Ian that conversation and arriving at moral codes is integral to the establishment of human rights and things like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes. And even if you think about it from a weirdly scriptural sense, it wasn't, and I'm going to be old school Christian here, so just bear with me. Right. It wasn't Genesis 1, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the 10 Commandments. That came later. So if you go with the literal, and I'm not necessarily a literalist, but if you go with a literalist point of view, you could argue, well, wait, God didn't drop the 10 Commandments as soon as he created earth. After Adam and Eve dropped the 10, this was later. So obviously there was something that happened between the communication of humans and God that said, okay, we need to maybe set some sort of guidelines that would help everybody live better.
Right, yeah. Like, so in the Bible, you don't have to be a biblical scholar to notice that morality does evolve through the course of the Bible. There's a big difference between the morality of Genesis and the morality of Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
And Christians readily recognize that. And even within the Old Testament, you see at the beginning, it's in the Torah, in the first 5 books, it's all about obedience to the law. And by the time you get to the prophets are not emphasizing the law. In fact, many of them would say, it's not about the sacrifice. It's not about obedience to the law. It's about social justice. It's about mercy. It's about love for the least of these, right? You find noises like that throughout the prophets. And I would say that's an improvement. There's improvement within the biblical narrative. Now, there are some Christians today who would like to go backwards. Or even, there are some Christians who want to freeze this progress in the first century and say, yes, well, the New Testament is perfect, is morally perfect, and now we don't need to progress anymore. But I think if we take the trajectory of the Bible, in many ways, that's a better way to take it. You shouldn't freeze this progress and say, okay, well, it stops with the New Testament, and there's no more room for conversation or improvement. I think that would be a mistake.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's another debate for another time. And maybe this is where, I don't know if I agree with Ian on this. I've invited him to come on the podcast. It's something I would love to converse more about. But he brought up this idea of human rights evolving over time. And I don't know if he said that or if he brought it up as a question. But it made me think a lot about, well, that's really interesting. There's some validity to that because simply women didn't have the right to vote until just recently, quite really, within the last triple-digit years. He brought up same-sex marriage as something that we've really just brought up as something legalized in 2004, so it's over 10 years. So as history, it feels to me like the idea of human rights and what that is has been an obvious concept since the beginning of time, and how that implements, I guess, has been involved. I kind of agree with him, but in a sense, I think that's kind of that feels like a blot on our human history.
It does, and I mean my problem with it. So just to I guess reiterate some agreement.
Yeah,
it's obvious that our understanding of human rights has changed over time, and then women's rights is one particularly embarrassing example of this that I brought up during the Q&A. Our concept of human rights has changed. Now, where Ian goes with this is he says, well, therefore, there's no real fact of the matter about which version of human rights is better to adopt, because he says that he's a relativist. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, you could make the same argument for science. Well, look, our understanding of physics has changed over time, which it clearly has. We had Newtonian physics, and then we moved to, with the 20th century, quantum mechanics and general relativity, which superseded our understanding of Newtonian physics. Or even to take a more, well-known example, we used to think the Earth that the sun revolved around the Earth. We no longer think that. We have changed our understanding. Yeah. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a fact of the matter. In fact, we would want to say we are closer to the truth now. And I think in a somewhat analogous way, our concept of how to build a better society has improved. We used to think that it was better to treat women as second-class citizens. We used to think that, and we were wrong to think that. I would want to say that. I don't know if Ian would. I suspect he wouldn't. I would say we were wrong to think that it was better to treat women as second-class citizens, and we are now, the ethics of 21st century North America are better than the views of 19th century North America.
Yeah.
And I think it changes the conversation when we say that. When we say, look, we're trying to get at truth here. We're trying to, get at truths about which societal norms better improve human flourishing. And there are going to be right and wrong answers about how to do that. And treating women like chattel is one of the bad ways to try and improve society. So that would be one disagreement with the idea that I would have.
I'm kind of with you. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about we'll tease the idea of relativism later. But it was sort of a challenge to me how that. I think he was right in terms of history, but I don't like it. It's kind of like Buckley's. It's good for us to know that, but it really tasted horrible to hear.
Oh, yeah, like the idea that, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's, because these are people, this is what makes it especially like Buckley's, what makes it very unpleasant is these were people just like us.
Yes.
Like the human genome has not changed dramatically in the last 100 years. This is not genetic. And the natural conclusion from that is, well, were I there, I would probably do the same thing.
Right.
Or worse, maybe I am doing the same thing now. Maybe there are issues today that we are morally blind about in the same fashion.
Right.
And that's unsettling. But I think actually it's good that we're unsettled. We should be very introspective about this. We should go, wait a second, humans are capable of being foolish and immoral and morally blind. I'm a human. I should take some time to evaluate myself.
Yeah. So that one was, I don't know if I want to, I agreed with him to a point. I think that was, but I do think that it should have been something that we were on from the beginning of time, but I've elaborated that enough. Let's move on.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess it might be, not to make a cheap shot, but it might be more surprising to you just because you believe that we are in some sense made in the image of God, and I think that we are animals. So I'm less surprised by human foolishness, perhaps.
No, I'm not surprised by our behavior as humanity, because I think that's historically accurate. What surprises me is I heard someone say this before, and I really think that it's a brilliant point. Just because it's 2018, and that's a whole argument. Well, we're in 2018. We've obviously progressed. That's not the point. It should be something that we are doing because it's right.
Right.
Not because this is the year and we are a progressive society.
Right. Yeah, basing it on societal norms, maybe that's problematic.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, it's not... I mean, I do think that moral norms will, in some sense, be... The fact that my beliefs are strongly influenced by the time in which I live. There's no way around it.
Of course, yeah, me too.
But it's possible for my society to teach me incorrectly. And I'm happy to name things that I think 2018 North American culture teach wrongly. I mean, one of my favorite examples is, sheeping out on giving to life-saving charities. Like, we spend money on the most ridiculous things. We're so wasteful, and children's lives can be saved for pocket change, right? And this is, we're raised, to not really care that much about it, and well, too bad. Our moral norms are flawed then, if that's the case. But yeah, I don't know if that quite answers your question.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. What's your next? Is it?
So so as far as disagreements with Bushfield, I think that, the main one was relativism and his signing up to that. And again, just to repeat, I think that it really matters that we get this right. Because otherwise, we get into a situation where if we have a moral disagreement, if we concede that there's no fact of the matter, there's no right answer, that really changes how the conversation goes. So let's take beauty, right? If we disagree about whether or not a painting is beautiful, let's say we look at a painting, I think it's beautiful, you think it's ugly. We can't really have a debate like that, about that, if we agree there's no truth. Because there's no real truth about which of us is right. It's just subjective. It's relative. There's no fact of the matter. But with moral issues, let's say you believe female gender... I'm not saying you believe this, but let's suppose... I'll make myself evil. Let's say I believe that female genital mutilation is good, and you think it's wrong. if we are relativists, then we can't really have a discussion about it because we say, well, no one's right. It's all relative. Who am I to judge? That's imperial for you to judge my way of life. But I would say, no, that's not the right way to have the conversation. We should go, look, there's a fact of the matter about which is better, and we should try to figure it out. And if you say there's no fact of the matter, then you've given up any mechanism for solving the conversation, solving the disagreement. I think that's a big problem. I think we need to be able to say, no, that's wrong, and it's not just and saying that's wrong is not the same thing as saying that painting is ugly. They're different sorts of statements.
See, this is gonna sound a little weird. I want to call BS on that.
Oh, really?
On Ian being a relativist.
Oh, yes, okay.
Because the way that he talked throughout, there was an obvious moral fiber to him in terms of what he is. As an example, near the end of the evening, they were about to shut down at 9:30, and during the Q&A, there was a female that was standing, and he's like, "We haven't heard from one single woman tonight."
Right.
And we were all like, and it's because it was just because that was the first one that came up. It wasn't like intentional or anything like that, but it was something that Ian noticed. And I don't believe he's relative, and I think it's almost impossible for me to believe that people are moral relativists in a general sense. Because I think that there's a moral fiber in our being, whether you believe that's from God or not, that tells us there's a right and a wrong. And there was even things he talked about, like the missing murdered Indigenous women. He talked about that. He talked about transphobia rights. He talked about same-sex marriage. I didn't believe him when he said he was a relativist.
Right. No, I think you're right to be skeptical of that. Now, I've heard it said that you can doubt whether or not there has ever been a consistent moral relativist. Moral relativism it's a very interesting possibility to kind of consider in a philosophy seminar, but in real life, almost no one actually abides by it. If someone comes to steal your stuff, you're going to make non-relativist noises. Yeah. You're going to say, no, that's wrong. You can't do that. Or whatever it is, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, if the murderer was to come to Ian Bushfield and say, no, look, like, this is just what I think is right. Who are you to judge? I think Ian would have a hard time being consistent and saying, no, it's just all relative. And I think actually Andy made a good point when he said, it's a bit like a flat earther who says, well, I'm going on an around the world cruise, right? You're not being consistent. And I think that one can make a very similar objection to moral relativism. Almost no one in practice is consistent with it.
Yeah. I don't really have anything. I wrote a bunch of stuff and I can't remember who wrote what. To me, I think overall, I thought Ian represented himself really well. The one thing that I only think of this, but I think there was opportunities that Ian could have pushed that argument, not the relativism argument, but there was a real opportunity in an objective point of way. I'm not saying that this was a debate, but there was some real tough questions presented to Christianity in the record of human rights, which I'm sure you're going to get into when we talked about Andy Bannister.
That's right. Yeah.
That I think I felt he let Dr. Bannister a little bit off the hook, actually.
Right.
I'm like sitting in there, like, there's a future conversation about where Christianity and human rights sits, and no greater of that debate is Billy Graham.
Yeah.
Whether, you can get one, we're not getting into Billy Graham, but there's some that would say that he was amazing, and there's some people that are really angry, and that's kind of the same thing. And I felt that there was an opportunity to push, and I think he let Andy a little bit off the hook there. I don't know what you...
That's fair. I mean, I think part of it might be, my sense, not that I'm a mind reader, I don't have the ability to do that, but I sense that what Ian wanted to do was to build a positive case for humanism more than he wanted to attack Christianity.
Right.
And this is a problem often with so-called atheism, right? Is that atheism just means you don't believe in God. So, all right, great. Well, what do you believe in? And Ian was focused more on, look, I believe in human conversation. I have faith in human conversation. Now, I wasn't in love with how he put it at the end. Well, you have faith in this, and I have faith in this. I wouldn't put it that way myself, but he wanted to have something positive to say. He didn't want to just attack religion. There's lots of YouTube videos that do a fine job of that you're all free to look up.
Yeah.
I think largely that case has been made well, but I think that what atheists are often missing, or what atheists often forget to do, is to build a positive case for human conversation. And I think, again, Ian is right to notice that most of the improvement in the world that we've seen in the last 500 years, or certainly a lot of it, has stemmed from honest, secular conversations about what makes society better. Often without invoking God, but that's more getting into what I disagree with Andy on, so maybe I'll hold off on some of my...
Yeah, but that's kind of my overall thing. I think we've unpacked a good... We unpacked most of what Ian had to say. There wasn't really anything else that I felt that Ian said that was completely out of turn. Or I think we covered him. He mentioned
that he did physics and that lasers were cool, so that was
that's
fun.
True. Yes.
But So shall we move on to Andy then?
Yeah, let's move on to Andy.
Maybe you can list your agreements first, or do you want me to list my agreements?
Let's start with you.
Okay. So as I talked about the last time I was on your podcast, I do consider myself still a kind of Christian. I still have a deep sense of attachment to the Christian tradition, and I agree with Andy that there is a certain nobility to the central Christian story, the idea that God became enfleshed and died for the sins of humanity. And I think that many atheists scorn that story. They find it very distasteful, but I think at its core, this is a story about self-sacrifice. This is a story about what love ought to look like. And it is, in many ways, my favorite story. This is a story that is a part of who I am, and I love returning to the story of the atonement, the story of Jesus dying for our sins. And even though, again, obviously, I don't believe that's literally true. I don't believe that there is a God, to become enfleshed and to die for sins. But I think that I think atheists miss out on the beauty of that story. So I would agree with Andy there. Do you have any response to that or any additional comments?
The part that I felt was most passionate was there was a gentleman there during the Q&A. I don't know if he was trying to be a troll or if he was sincere in his meaning or what. But he caught up there and basically said what Jesus said was, he said some really awful things.
Oh, and I come not to bring peace but a sword.
Yeah.
Which is, it's so cringily taken out of context. And I think there are, you can find problematic things in the Bible. There's no need to, wrench that one from its context. In fact, I believe Sam Harris used that too once, which is unfortunate. But no one's perfect.
And I just loved the way he answered that. It was very clear you haven't read the Bible to this person, and it was very clear that you're not understanding and you look at human history. I thought that was a really that's an obvious place where I would agree with Dr. Bannister in an obvious sense. He used a lot of humor, which was great. I'm trying to as I go through my notes here. He talked about the Constitution and the Human Rights Constitution,
right?
Which I found, which was basically back to Ian Bushfield's argument of where human rights come from. Do they evolve over time? I thought it was interesting and forming some sort of commonality, but I'm not sure. This is, I guess, maybe where I disagree with him a little bit. I'm not sure if I disagree. I'm not sure if I know where he's going with that.
Right. I mean, I guess I think that the quotes were, where he would read quotes from the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and I think he was trying to, I guess, kind of get a starting place. These are the sorts of things we're talking about when we talk about human rights, and where I am in the middle. I'm not sure I agree or disagree, but what he wanted to make the case for in part was that Christianity historically has played an important role in the establishment of human rights. And there, I'm very open-minded about that. I think that that's a perfectly open historical question. What exactly is the role that Christianity played in the establishment of human rights? The question that I asked in the Q&A was, what about women's rights? This, to my knowledge, emerged largely out of secular thinkers like John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was an atheist. He was the first male that I know of who said, wait a second, keeping women as slaves in the home is immoral and unjustified and makes no sense. I don't know of any, males in the Western tradition saying things like that. And his argument for that is entirely secular. He makes no appeals to God. It's just that this is harmful. This is not good for society. It's harming women for no good reason, and we should stop this. Now, you can appeal to other historical instances where maybe Christianity had a better, or was more integral to the foundation of to arguing for human rights. And actually, with respect to women, Andy did bring up that for its time in the early church, Christianity was actually, closer to a modern conception of women's equality than the surrounding worldviews were. He quoted a critic of Christianity named Celsus, who said Christianity is the religion of women and slaves. And that actually, I hadn't heard that before. I thought that was a very interesting argument. That actually, for its time, Christianity was more pro-women and attracted women on this basis. And so again, the exact extent to which Christianity was a positive contribution is an open historical question, but those would be my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what I did appreciate about his argument overall, that is, he acknowledged that there could have been better, which may, for some people, have been like, well, that's kind of, you're backtracking out of it. But there's another sense that, also that I do think sometimes in the middle of our social media arguments, we do forget that Christianity did contribute in a positive way. And there were some people that did do that. And we do forget that, not that we need to have some sort of acknowledgement or pound on the back, but I do think that he brought up some really interesting points. As I said, I felt that Ian could have pushed back a bit on a couple of things. Specifically, I know historically with a lot of the indigenous communities in Christianity, there's many indigenous communities that are very offended how Christianity treated them.
Oh yeah, and here in Canada, that's still a fresh wound. I mean, the last residential school closed in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Like, that's when I was, I was alive, roughly, or when the last one closed. I mean, that's shocking. And the church played an integral role in the residential school system. And that's, totally unacceptable. And the church, at least some churches, have made efforts at repairing that. Although I believe the Catholic Church has still not apologized for its role. So that's there's room for improvement there.
Yeah, which he acknowledged, and I think that that's a good thing. A good thing.
As far as disagreements, it's touching a bit on the historical role of Christianity. What I will defend is the following claim, something like this. And I believe Ian actually did push back on this question. If we look at any objective look at human progress, we'll notice that the most intense period of human progress on any measure is the last 500 years or so. If you look at any issue like life expectancy, equality of women, equality for racial minorities, slavery, science, medicine, this is the hot spot. This is where life has just been getting better across the board for everyone. And Christianity's role in the Enlightenment, which is this period, is ambiguous, right? I mean, some will argue that Christianity and the church played a positive role in the Enlightenment, and others will say that it slowed it down. Again, that's an open historical question. But I think that, I'm just going to put that even aside and just say that I think that the key feature of the Enlightenment is the emphasis on reason. The emphasis on is having good reasons for believing what you believe, on allowing the natural world to, refute your beliefs, or holding them up to be tested, and holding up your moral beliefs to be tested by human conversation. Right? This is key, and if Christianity helped us get that, thank you very much, Christianity. But in any case, I think that we can appeal directly to the value of reason and say that that's really the key engine of the progress that we've seen. And because the 1,500 years prior, and I think Andy acknowledged this, that the 1,500 years prior were not great for progress. And Andy said that's because Christianity got into power, into government.
Yeah.
And that's where all the problems started, and fair enough.
But you could argue that was humans, though, and not necessarily purely only religion, but you could argue that that's anyone that gets into power feels some sort of corruption.
Oh, yeah, like there's that famous quote, right? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Oh, sure, I mean, of course, I think it is humans. Religious beliefs may play a role, but I mean, humans are pretty good at finding reasons to be awful to one another. I think the only thing I'm trying to say is that I think that the key engine of progress is not religion. It may play a role, but the key engine, at least in the last 500 years, has been reason. I would want to plant a flag there.
I would too. I think that's a good place. That's good to plant there. This wasn't Dr. Bannister's specific argument, but this was more in the Q&A. I get a little perturbed when the question comes up, well, Ian, if you don't believe in a God, where do you base your morals on? And we got a little bit of that feedback during the Q&A, and it just sort of grinds me the wrong way because it's just such a naive question to me.
Right.
Because, I mean, you don't have to look far into human history to realize that there was people that believed in God that didn't show any morality whatsoever. And you could argue that there's people that didn't believe in God that showed more morality than those that were religious. I mean, I just can type in, Google is your friend. You don't need that. And so I really get, and I really, to be fair, I thought Dr. Bannister tried to steer that conversation clearly away. But there is a sense in that room, and that's home field advantage maybe, that we talked a little bit about earlier.
It was in a church.
Yeah. That there's this assumption that the ungodly don't have any morals.
Yeah, and Andy steered it away from that. I mean, I think that the well-educated version of that question is, if there's no God, what is the basis for moral truth, for saying that there's moral truth? Sure, you guys can be good people, but what is the sort of basis for saying anything is good at all? I mean, that's a perfectly intelligent question to ask. It's one that I think atheists can give an answer to. But yeah, I think it is an important one to ask. And a disagreement I have with Andy is, I do think you can have a foundation for moral claims or for claims about what's better without invoking a supernatural realm to ground them. So that would be a rather unsurprising disagreement, but that would be one disagreement.
Do you have another one?
Another one, well, I have written down just that, I mean, obviously I don't believe in God or miracles or a supernatural realm. And as I said, I'm not convinced that Christianity's role in the establishment of human rights has been that central. I think that you could argue at certain times it was ahead of the curve, and at other times maybe retrograde, but I think overall, I think the key engine is reason. That's the key engine of human progress. Yeah. I suppose... Well, here's one bonus agreement for free.
Okay.
One specific example of Christianity being ahead of the curve that I'm starting to get in touch with, because I'm taking a class in ancient philosophy right now, and I think that what's interesting about the ancient Greek conception of moral goodness, or of goodness in general, is it was very self-centered. This is something that's very interesting. They didn't really have a concept of morality as concern for the other. If you're a virtuous person, according to Aristotle or Epicurus or whoever, it's about being an excellent person, or being a maximally happy person, or maximally courageous or wise, or etc. List virtues, but it's not necessarily about benefiting others.
Right.
This is something that I think Christianity has added to the West, and I think was a good addition. In Christianity, morality is to be self-sacrificial. It's about concern for the other, and I think that was a good addition. Now, that's not only in Christianity; you can see that in the Eastern religions too. But that would be an area where I think the humanists should credit Christianity, perhaps, for adding, a concern for others into our view of morality. And this, Andy would cheer right now and say yes, and that is what helped give rise to our Western morality and our notion of morality as concern for the other. I think you could make that case pretty powerfully.
Yeah. The other thing, I don't want to say I disagree with him. He brought up a lot of, in his argument, he was bringing up a lot of, if you look at human history, I'll present an argument from the atheist that said that Christianity did this, which was a pretty interesting way to argue, but you could actually refute that in many ways and say, well, there's actually other people that would not say that. And I can't think of a specific example. I didn't write down a specific example for tonight, but the whole, but he did that a lot. If you actually, the atheist said, this atheist actually looks at human rights and that Christianity is just human rights, and it was an atheist. So, but there's other people that wouldn't. So I felt that was a bit of a tricky argument, way to debate, but not necessarily true. Does that make sense?
Right. So sorry, just back up. Sorry, the claim they're responding to is that Christianity has a good role in
his argument of Christianity having a good role in human rights, or a good role in bringing in the atheist. This is what an atheist philosopher said,
right?
To prove his point.
Right. I mean, and this is an interesting tactic that apologists will often make, where they quote atheists that agree with them.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's an interesting strategy, and Andy could have done it in this conversation. Say, look, Ian actually agrees that without God you can't have objective morality, because he says, well, I'm a relativist. Now we can debate whether or not he's consistent in that, but and many atheists have conceded that if there's no God, then morality is just relative, it's just a social construction, there's no moral truth. Nietzsche, Sartre, J.L. Mackie, you can quote the big names, atheists who will say that, and Andy did that to great effect. And I will just say, great, they're wrong, and I will list my favorite atheist philosophers who say, no, you can have a grounding for moral truth without talking about God or supernatural realm. But one thing I guess I'll go back to, since I've listed off all my main agreements and disagreements, is that even though I disagree with Ian that you can, I think you can say that some things are objectively better than others. Even though I think that in practice, it is human conversation that makes the difference. It is human conversation that will allow us to improve society more. And actually that theological considerations can sometimes slow human progress. Here's what I mean by that. If we're having a conversation and I say, well, look, I just believe this because God said so. I believe that homosexuality is sinful because it says so in Romans 1, and that's just what I believe. Statements like that are conversation stoppers.
Yeah.
Right? As soon as someone has drawn that line, there's no way you can make progress. Whereas if I say, look, I believe that, I believe women should stay in the home. But you know what? I'm open to having a conversation about it, right? And I have some reasons. Like I think women naturally should stay in the home. I think that there are, it's in their nature to enjoy that, and it's better for society if they stay at home. Okay, even though that's wrong, I'm open to having my mind changed about it because I'm giving reasons for my belief.
Right.
And then someone can respond and say, actually, societies are reliably better off if you give women equal rights, and we know that that's true. And women are reliably better off if they have control over their reproductive rights and can go into the workplace and can be autonomous. So I think that if theological arguments are made in absolutist terms, if you say, look, God said so, that's the end of the story, that is a reliable way to stop the conversation and to keep humans from improving. And the same is true for secular political systems that are absolutist, like certain forms of communism, where it's like, look, this is the best way to improve society. If you argue against that, we're sending you to the gulag. Well, that's not, it's the same kind of dogmatism. Dogmatism is the key problem. Openness to conversation is how you can advance.
Yeah. And as Brad Jerzak said in a previous podcast, we were talking a bit about the idea of thoughts and prayer. And one of the things that he said is that it's dangerous for those that flip one way or the other if you keep your anger. So for those that have converted to Christianity and you're still angry, it's not helping. And it's the same way for those that have moved from a Christian point of view to an atheist point of view. If you keep your anger, it's not helping the conversation and still keep the idea of dialogue going.
What do you mean by keep the anger?
Just keep it, maybe it's a poor way of it, not releasing or dealing with the issue that is keeping you angry. Not that anger is wrong,
right.
But it's holding on to that kind of the hatred part of the anger isn't healthy.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this might be in a somewhat different vein, but there's a famous quote from the Buddha that is, being angry at someone or not forgiving them is like drinking poison and expecting them to die. Right?
Yeah.
There is something, very unhealthy about, unforgiveness and bitterness.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Hard to live out in practice, though, when you're pissed off at someone. But,
that's fair.
But, I think that's a wise insight.
Yeah. The other, I was going to say something that I thought, I can't remember.
I'm sure it was good. I'll just imagine you have.
It was brilliant.
It was brilliant.
It was absolutely brilliant. There was two other quick things. There was a conversation around Down syndrome that we didn't have a lot.
Ooh.
Yeah,
right.
That's a future conversation we'll have to unpack, but something we don't.
It's an interesting one to talk about, but it relates to a very controversial area called eugenics, right?
Yeah.
The idea of sterilizing people, or in the most extreme version of Nazi Germany, killing people who are undesirable, in scare quotes. And I mean, the history of eugenics is just fraught with terror and atrocity and terrible things. But I think Ian rightly kind of stayed away from that one. Maybe it's more inflammatory than is needed. So
it was. And the last question that came up, I think, really that hit me was the idea of family human rights. Something that, I guess, in that evolution conversation that is worth unpacking. But I really liked that question as well. Maybe the best way to end this, or did you have anything else to add before we go to it?
No, you can go to the end.
If you had Ian and Andy here and you were allowed one more question for them, what would it be?
Great. Oh, we should ask this in advance, but
I know. I just came up with it now.
No, that's fine. It's a great question. If I had one more question for Andy, I think I would ask him, and he may have sort of answered this already, but I want to hear him say, what does he think the key engine of the Enlightenment was? So the engine of the progress we've seen over the last 3 to 5 centuries, right? So with human rights and so on, And does he think that the key driver of that really is Christianity as opposed to reason? And if so, why the 1,500 years of slowness, in terms of progress, and in some cases going backwards? That would be my biggest question for him. And he touched on that at various points in the conversation, but I'd like to put it to him like that. And I guess my question for Ian would be, what would he say, right? So if we have a case of something like female genital mutilation, which in certain cultures is accepted and actually encouraged, to my knowledge, is he willing to say that's wrong? And it's not wrong just because, in my culture it's wrong, but it actually is wrong. There's actually a fact of the matter that that's a worse way to run society. And if he says no, well, then I want to have a longer conversation with him, I suppose. So I want to ask him that.
Yeah. I guess, I like your question for Ian, too. I think, I would call him out on it. I don't want to say call him out on his relativism, but I want to clarify what he means by relativism. Basically, that's my question. What do you mean by that? Because your presentation wasn't relative to me, so I feel that's a little inconsistent. My question for Andy, I think, would be, where do you see Christianity and human rights 10 years from now? Because there's a lot of stuff that Christianity has stood against. Not for. I think, there's some, not all, Christians have stood behind Trump, and I think human history is going to show that to be very questionable. Like in 10 years, where do you see Christianity and human rights intersecting?
No, that's a good question. Trump really is an interesting phenomenon because he's the least Christian president the U.S. has perhaps ever had.
Yeah.
You ever ask God for forgiveness? Nope. Any other president, that would be the final nail in the coffin. And he's obviously an adulterer. He's obviously a womanizer, and by his own words, grabs women without asking. Just so obviously not a strongly Christian person, and yet he still wins 80% of white evangelical votes, if I have my numbers right. Yeah. Which is it is very troubling. And I wish that maybe this is a good thing for me to say too. I think Christianity and the biblical tradition has wonderful parts to it. I love to return to Bannister's quote from Celsus. Christianity at the time was in many ways the religion of women and slaves. There are elements in the Christian tradition that are wonderful, that are countercultural, that are pro-social justice, like the prophets that I mentioned earlier. But there are, in my view, also uglier parts of the tradition too. And many parts of American Christianity cling to the ugly parts. They have the 6 verses against homosexuality memorized, and then they forget the 1,000 verses about giving to the poor and the immigrant and the refugee. And I hope that Christianity can make that transition to celebrating and emphasizing the good parts of their tradition. Yeah. Maybe that's a good.
That's
for me to put
and I to me it's I think the ultimate conversation that came to a conclusion is I think that there's a real important conversation about human rights are very important, and I think in the midst of all of our yelling, we didn't yell, but in the yelling on social media and stuff, that gets forgotten. I think everyone is on the same page of the idea of human rights is very important. How we get there, I think, is a different conversation, and I think maybe evolves, and why that is, I think, is different for every people. But the idea of human rights, I think, we agree on.
Right. I'll add a quote from a Christian, G.K. Chesterton, who said, it's not about fighting for your side. It's about fighting to be on the right side. And that fighting takes place in conversations like this one. Yeah.
Right. So, how do we follow you?
Follow me. I mean, you could add me on Facebook, David Simpson. I post controversial things every once in a while. But frankly, right now, I don't have much of a life, and I'm not posting very much because I have 5 courses, and I'm volunteering as a TA and working as a tutor. So, I'm... not much to follow me. Maybe in 5 years, follow me. Maybe when I have some letters in front of my name, or it might take longer than that. But I hope to get a PhD in philosophy, and maybe then I'll have time to, have something to follow. But.
Yes, fair enough. We're sitting here in Douglas College at a study library here recording, so David took some time out, and so we appreciate that. You know how to follow me, facebook.com, KEVOLE, soundcloud.com, KEVOLE, Twitter, KEVOLE, Spreaker.com, KEVOLE. Subscribe on YouTube as well. Thanks, everyone, for listening to Agree to Disagree the podcast, and we will talk to you all very soon. Bye for now.